because we are behind schedule and we don't want to overrun this evening. My name's Mark Pearson and I'm going to be your moderator for this last session of the day. We've been inspired by two events, two cities, I think, for this last session. The first city is Paris, where, as you know, we had the Olympics this year. We were all very excited, those of us who lived in Paris, by the Olympics. Amazing achievements, including feats of endurance. And that's what inspired us, of course, to have, for some reason, 4 hours of you sitting there without any break. You know, because if those athletes can do it in Paris at the Olympics, you can sit there for 4 hours, can't you? If they can run around for 40 kilometers, you can sit for 4 hours. I'm shattered by just sitting there quietly. I'm sure you are too. But nevertheless, I hope we'll have an exciting last session here. The other city that I think was my own hometown of Hull. Very, very similar, for those who know it, to Paris. Identical in many respects. Yeah, maybe not. But what happened in August this year in Hull, as in many cities in England, was that there was a series of riots, anti-migrant riots. And, you know, it kind of brought home to me that what the typical day in the life of a rioter in Hull would have been that they got up in the morning, maybe had their haircut by a self-employed immigrant hairdresser. They'll have then gone to have a curry served by a self-employed immigrant chef. They will then certainly have had a pint or 6 or 7 in a pub, probably in that area of Hull, owned by a self-employed barman, and they will take an Uber to go to the place where the riots were to take place, driven by a self-employed Uber driver. And then they'll have held up a sign saying, immigrants are stealing our jobs. I mean, there's a certain amount of irony there, isn't there? And yet it's a story that we don't tell very often about migration. And that's why we wanted to talk about migrant entrepreneurship and their contribution to the economy of migrants in this last session. So I'm looking forward very much. I'm going to introduce the panelists as we go through you. But let me start with you, Jean-Christophe. Will you do the introductory statements? I don't know if you want to stand here? Yeah.
Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jean-Christophe Dumont, and I'm the head of the International Migration Division at the OECD. I certainly look forward to actively contributing to the work program of the CREAT Center, notably regarding the nexus between migration and demography. But as Mark just said, for this forum, I'm happy to share with you and then publish OECD report on migrant entrepreneurship. This will be released on November 14th with the OECD Secretary General and the European Commission. So please consider this material as under embargo until this date. A bit of context first. Migration to the OECD, as you all know, has largely increased in recent years, and notably since the COVID pandemic. Every year, we count between 5 and 6 million new permanent immigrants to the OECD, plus 4 to 5 million temporary foreign workers, plus 2 million asylum seekers, plus 2 million international students. Between 2013 and 2023, the share of foreign-born has increased from 9% to 11% on average in the OECD, and actually, as it was mentioned this morning by the ambassador, much more in Greece. There are some large disparities, indeed, regarding this change, as you can see on this graph. But what is important to note is that everywhere, the number and the share of tertiary educated immigrants has increased. More than 1 in 3 immigrants is currently tertiary educated, and this is about 50 million people across the OECD. But in this context, it's fair to say that the public debate mostly focuses on issues such as the fiscal impact of migration. Tito mentioned that before. We did a special chapter in the International Migration Outlook in 2021, which I encourage you to take a look at if you're interested by evidence on the fiscal impact of migration. as well as on whether migrants displace native workers or not, notably regarding wage and employment, even if on that particular matter, evidence from the economic literature is fairly clear and positive, actually. But migrants also create jobs, notably through entrepreneurship, and this is the special topic of the topic of a special chapter in the 2024 International Migration Outlook. Across the OECD, 17% of all entrepreneurs are migrants. So we're talking about 10 million migrant entrepreneurs in the OECD. This is 6 percentage points more than 16 years ago, and for about 80%, this is due to increasing migration, and for about 20%, this is due to the increasing propensity of migrants to become self-employed. On average, self-employment rate of immigrants is 13.8% across the OECD, compared to 13.4% for native-born, so actually very close. There are a few countries where migrants are more likely to be entrepreneurs: Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovak Republic, plus 5 percentage points. Canada, Portugal, Spain, United States, 3 to 4 percentage points. But there are also a few countries where they are less likely to be entrepreneurs, like in Japan and Korea, minus 3 to 4 percentage points, or actually in Greece, Italy, and Iceland, between 5 and 7 percentage points less. In general, migrant women are less likely to be self-employed than migrant men. For example, in Greece, migrant men are self-employed at 18.5% compared to 13.5% for migrant women, so there's a 5 percentage point difference. But there are a few countries where the gap is much larger, like in Finland, minus 13 percentage points, Belgium, minus 11 percentage points, or Czech Republic and the UK, minus 10 percentage points. In 2022, 43% of all immigrant self-employed were tertiary educated. So that compares to, on average, 1 in 3 being tertiary educated. So the more educated you are, the more likely you will be self-employed. This compares to 42%, so almost similar for the native-born. Migrant entrepreneurs create jobs in all sectors of activity, but are overrepresented in all regions, notably, and that won't be a surprise, in accommodation and food services, and in transportation and storage. We do observe a more mixed picture, for example, in construction, where immigrants are overrepresented only in the EU and the United States, or in wholesale and retail trade, where immigrants are overrepresented mostly in the UK and in Canada. That being said, immigrants contribute disproportionately to innovation. 45% of the world's 500 largest companies, that comes from Future 500, were founded by an immigrant or children of immigrants. In the United States, immigrants have started more than half of America's startup companies' values at 1 billion or more. However, beyond these exceptional firms, the share of self-employed in sectors classified as high or medium high, research and development intensive, is fairly low, at about 5%, both for native-born and immigrants. This means that immigrants contribute disproportionately to innovation, mostly because they are higher share in self-employment. Migrants' contribution to employment is, however, limited by the fact that migrant entrepreneurs are more likely, in 2/3 of OECD countries at least, to be on-account self-employed, meaning that they have no employees. About 1/3 of migrant self-employed, however, do have employees. We estimated that for each 10 working-age migrants, an additional 2 jobs are added to the economy. This implies that between 2011 and 2021, more than 4 million additional jobs were created through migrant entrepreneurship. This corresponds roughly to 15% of employment growth between 2011 and 2021 in the OECD. Well, there is scope to further support migrant entrepreneurship. In OECD, EU, EFTA country, for example, more migrant employees than native-born would like to be self-employed, 13% compared to 9% according to EU LFS. The main reason stated for not becoming self-employed for both foreign-born and native-born is financial insecurity, 41% for both groups. However, immigrants report more difficulties in getting financing to set up their own business, 21% compared to 17% for native-born. OECD countries have various tools to support migrant entrepreneurship, but most countries actually support migrant entrepreneurship through integration programs. This is the case, for example, in Greece, where the Migrant Integration Center that have been set up in 11 municipalities support labor market integration of third country nationals, including by providing support on setting up a business, legal and financial advice, networking opportunity, etc. But in most cases, nonetheless, this type of support can be quite broad and not sufficiently tailored to diverse needs of migrants. A long-established good practices is the CNA World Dedalo project in Italy. Among other things, the program offers support for self-employed immigrants to open a bank account and access financing. The program has set up a credit guarantee consortium whose main activity is to act as a guarantors for banks facilitating access to loans for migrant entrepreneurs. So let me conclude here and emphasize again that in the public debate on migration, unfortunately, the focus is mostly on the negative impact, but migrants do contribute to creating employment, and we should not underestimate the potential of migrants as business owners and ensure that migrants have access to adequate support to fulfill their potential. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thanks, Jean-Christophe, also for being quite brief. That was much appreciated. And I know it was hard for you. It's not your normal thing to be brief. So that was
indeed.
But let's go to our panel now. So great panel. I'm going to introduce you as I ask you the questions rather than all at the beginning. So let me start with you, Evie Dramaliotti, who's the Secretary General of Coordination at the Presidency here in Greece, which itself is a fascinating job, which I only found out today. But you have a role in looking at migration policies across governments. You know, what's the view of the Greek government about the main channels through which immigrants can contribute to the economic growth of Greece, of host countries, and what policy actions do you think can make the most of that potential?
First of all, thank you. I'm very happy that I'm here today. Working with OECD is a great pleasure, always. And the Secretary General for Coordination has achieved great challenges with the support of the OECD. And we owe many thanks also to the Greek representation at OECD and Mr. Pagoulatos for the support. About migration and immigrants, the General Secretariat for Coordination, as you said, has the overview of what is going on in the ministries. That's why we also follow the annual action plan by the Ministry of Migration, but also the plans of coming from the other ministries, because most of the actions, as you know, are interministerial. So it is vital for us to follow that immigrants and their children are well integrated in the economy. So if we want to talk about migration policies, the most important thing is to see what policies for integration you design and then monitor as for implementation. That's why we have updated our national strategy for integration, and we put much emphasis on young people, minors, and then adults that decide to live and work in Greece. As you said, the most important thing so that we can support these people is to have some migration integration programs. These programs, both for migrants and also many programs for refugees, because as you know, Greece supported the refugee crisis for many years. There are many programs, migration, the refugee programs, and we first of all put emphasis on the language, because if you see what people say coming to Greece, the most difficult thing, the biggest barrier, is to know the language so that you can find for a job. So we have many programs for this, because Greek is a main requirement. Many integration courses, Greek language courses, courses that have to do with getting closer to the Greek culture, as well as modules for the development of soft skills, life skills, and job readiness. There are many programs funded by EU, and we have also the support of the United Nations services, the International Organization for Labor, the International Organization for Migration, and the main also issue is to have a great link with NGOs, consult with them, consult with the people that have to address this issue. And I think that the Ministry of Migration has made many steps forward in order to come closer to the needs of the people, and they're having a more robust public dialogue. So we have many more programs and a better website, giving more information to people and giving more information to enterprises at a local level, so they can know what the needs are and what supply we can have from people coming from third countries.
Did you try and draw on? I mean, Greece got a massive diaspora, of course, out there. We've already heard about some of the policies to try and attract back Greeks from the diaspora back to Greece.
Yeah.
How effective are those policies? Are they working in bringing back?
This is a great challenge, together with the policies for migrants, which is a complementary policy in order to keep up with labor shortages. We also want to empower the participation of women, young people, and also we have to deal with the brain drain. We're very happy now that we have great numbers of return of highly qualified people coming back to Greece, and this has to do with the economic prosperity, the greater numbers, economy is going very well, and this can be also presented at the recent OECD economic surveys having to do with the economic prosperity in Greece. So we have to build more on this getting back, or using mostly the diaspora community benefits. These people are highly qualified, they love Greece, and they want to offer more, even if they come back, or they can also support Greece from where they stand right now.
Very good, very good. Right, we'll come back to some of those issues, I'm sure. But let's move on to our next panelist, who is Ibrahim Awad, who is, wow, he's got an amazing CV. Currently, you're Professor of Global Affairs and Director for the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University in Cairo. But in the past, you've worked for the League of Arab States, United Nations, and in particular, of course, the ILO, including as the head of the International Migration Office at the ILO headquarters. So, Ibrahim, what sectors usually benefit from immigrants, labour and entrepreneurship? Is there scope for immigration policies to attract more high-skilled labour and investment by, I don't know, simplifying permit procedures or whatever else to simplify the process?
Well, Mark, let me say, I think Jean-Christophe, in his presentation, addressed all these issues. But let me say that not all migrants can be entrepreneurs. So I think that first thing to have a successful policy is to identify who can be an entrepreneur, because otherwise you're wasting resources. Yeah. So first of all, identify who can be an entrepreneur. Second, I think that we should ask ourselves, entrepreneurship. Jean-Christophe had just said that the percentage of entrepreneurs among migrants is significantly higher than among the population. And we know that when you have a distinctly high share of migrants in certain sector or occupation, this is expressive of distinctive treatment of migrants.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that this is necessarily something to be solved.
Yeah.
Because if the share is higher, it might be because there are problems in the migrants joining labor market as dependent workers. Yeah. So I think these are issues that need to be addressed. In fact, this panel I could have participated commenting on Jean-Christophe, even though I don't have his presentation. But your question, obviously, in Europe, there has been an increase in the intake of highly skilled migrants. Historically, low-skilled migrants came to Europe, highly skilled, went to North America, and United States and Canada. So policies have produced their effects. Now, I think yes, if you have a policy, you can attract migrants to contribute as entrepreneurs in highly skilled sectors. I cannot say exactly where they can do that, because I think we need to study the socioeconomic characteristics of the migrants, but we also need to study the markets, the good markets and service markets, because it's not about training the migrants only. It's about demand, where demand is. So demand will differ in Spain than in Germany, in Greece than in Poland. So I think that we cannot say to start with they can do this or they can contribute that. I think it depends on the structure of the economy. It depends on the structure of the labor market, and as I said, it depends on the abilities and the educational levels of the migrants, where they come from also, and to which extent they can be easily inserted in the society of country of destination. A migrant worker coming from India might find it more difficult to integrate in society and therefore in the labor market in France than a migrant coming from, let's say, Tunisia. A migrant worker coming from Moldova, for instance, would find it easier to integrate in Italy than a migrant worker coming from. So I think there are cultural issues also to be taken into account. But let me say something we discussed before. I think Professor Boeri said something extremely important this morning. If you want migration to contribute to making up for the dwindling labor force, you need to work on the narrative for migration. This is the context. Without a change in the narrative of migration, you might say something and do something else, by the way, which some countries do. But I think this will lead at a certain point to a clash. So you need to work on the narrative. And the migrants contribute. Migrants are criminality. If you take rate of criminality relative to migrants, is something. But if you take the rate relative to the income groups of the migrants and of the host population, it will be different. If you take them with regard to their employment status, it will be different. So I think this is part of the narrative and part of creating the context for dealing with migration. Finally, again, and it's not only about entrepreneurship, since the morning, in all panels, migration was mentioned.
Yes.
In all panels. Can you deal with migration? Can you deal with low fertility rates, dwindling labor forces, without having a global perspective?
Yeah.
Are high fertility rates in the global south? I'm the only one from the global south here. Are high fertility rates in the global south to be fought, as the Deputy Minister of Labor said that in the 1980s it was studied in development economics? Or do we need to consider fertility rates globally in their entirety? So I think many issues here could be raised, issues of importance, within which participation in labor market is inserted, and migrants as possible entrepreneurs could be discussed.
A million things it would be great to follow up on. But in fact, I'm going to go, if you don't mind, just very quickly to you, Jean-Christophe, because I'm sure what Ibrahim said is what a lot of people were thinking when they saw that chart about, 17% of migrants are entrepreneurs or self-employed or entrepreneurs compared to 11% of native-born. I mean, some of that is great because they want to be entrepreneurs. Some of it is because they can't get a job in the normal labour market, and so the only thing they can do is to... Is there any way to sort of think about what the balance is there? How do we interpret those numbers?
First of all, I need to clarify the numbers, because it's 17% of entrepreneurs who are migrants, and that up from 11%, so plus 6% in the past 16 years. And when it comes to the share of migrants who are entrepreneurs, this is actually very close to the native-born on average, 13.8, 13.4. So the gap is not so big. But indeed, in the chapter, we do look at this, and we find that for about 80%, this is entrepreneurship is an opportunity. So basically, we look at people position in the labor market before they were self-employed, and for the 80%, they were already employed, so we can assume this is an opportunity. And for about 20%, this is a necessity. So yes, entrepreneurship is used to circumvent the difficulties in the labor market, but it's a little bit more complex than this, actually.
Yeah, still, that's quite a high proportion, that 80%. It's a more, or at least a more positive story.
Opportunity, yes.
Could be told, yeah. Christine, can I come to you now? Now, Christine she's a full-time professor at the EUI. Those of you who know the EUI, it is the most beautiful place to be an academic in the entire world. So I am horribly, horribly jealous of you. You've chair in business and comparative politics at the Florence School of Transnational Governance. Used to be an associate professor in the Business, Government and International Economy unit at Harvard Business School. Okay, quite impressive. Very good. How can the education and training system be better tailored to the needs of immigrants? And we know that it often fails. I mean, what are the sorts of things that we should be looking at in order to improve?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, to the organizers for having me. It's a great honor to be here and to be part of this discussion. I think the education system is obviously quite central. Evie touched on a number of these issues when she talked about the issue of integration, which is key, starting with the very basic premise of things like language. And let me basically make two remarks on this point, or maybe three, as we think about education and education policy vis-a-vis immigrants. The first is that despite what people would like, and a lot of discussion that we've had here today about filling gaps and shortages in the labor market and attracting the people you want, oftentimes, and especially in frontline states like Italy, like Greece, like Spain, you oftentimes don't get to choose who arrives in your country. That's not a choice, and that's exogenously determined by external factors. And so you may have policies that can control some aspects of that, but they won't be able to control everything. So policies need to be in place to absorb and educate and integrate with the expectation that you're not choosing at the outset. And so that requires, some of the comments that Professor Vetas made earlier, flexibility, I think, in that approach, first and foremost. The second thing that I'll say is that universities are amazing engines for integration when it comes to immigration and immigration policy. And so the more foreign students you have in universities, and many countries have very innovative policies for allowing them to stay and integrate into the labor market more long-term. I come from the US, so the H-1B visa is very famous there for allowing you to work for a period of time. Oftentimes you get an employment contract, and these are really key drivers of innovation and entrepreneurship, and I think they're policies that should probably be adopted more widely. And if you're looking for high-skilled immigration, retailoring education policy at the collegiate level or at the university level should be top of mind. The third thing that I'll say, and it's maybe a little bit on a more pessimistic or challenging note, is that if you look at public opinion research, and that's primarily the type of research that I've been doing these days, one of the foremost concerns that people have about integration, native-born people, is basically their children interacting with children from other places in a school setting. And that's typically primary school, secondary school, or not having the staff capable of teaching children who come with different skill sets, whether it be in language or in background. And so primary education, secondary education for new arrivals is a real flashpoint in terms of public opinion. It tends to polarize public opinion quite heavily, whether native-born children and refugee and immigrant children should go to the same schools, oftentimes comes highly politicized. And then I said I would say three things, but maybe I will say one more, which is that there's been some discussion here about lifelong education and also about this talk about credentials. And so I'll say one thing about lifelong education, and then I'll say one thing about credentials. I think the Minister Carameo said it best, is that we need more of a lifelong education model. People are going to be changing jobs more often. That applies both for native-born populations and for foreigners who immigrate elsewhere. So they need to be part of those lifelong education processes and procedures. And then if you want to have successful integration policies, a real bottleneck tends to be at the level of credentials and credentialization and recognizing credentials and mutual recognition of credentials. So just a case in point, here we are in Greece. It's very difficult sometimes to have foreign certifications, foreign university certificates, anything basically certified from a foreign country. And it's even more difficult if you're coming from a country in the global south, where there's not a lot of experience in recognizing those credentials. So as we think about labor market integration, entrepreneurship, and education, thinking about how to harmonize recognition of credentials, I think, is also a really important part of the discussion that's often missing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we feel that certainly at OECD. We talk about credentials a lot. When you're in your work, Ibrahim, does this come up as well? I mean, do people, if you like, in Global South, do they feel the need to have better credentialing in order to enable more successful migration, or is that in a different...
The recognition of credentials, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of course, certainly this is a major impediment to insertion in the labor market.
Yeah.
And you can find this even between South America and Spain, for instance.
Yeah.
Even to this extent. Yes, certainly this is a major problem. Certainly.
Yeah. And why is it, Christine? Why is it particularly schools that become the flashpoint? I mean, it sort of seems almost doesn't seem kind of rational almost. I mean, you can almost see it in some of the other areas, maybe, you know, competition for health services which are scarce or something. But in a school, when we've got declining school populations, when, you know, obviously having diversity there is something that the kids love. Is there any reason why it is schools that are the flashpoints?
Schools are a flashpoint. Hospitals are also a flashpoint.
Well, yeah.
I would say public services in general and utilization of public services oftentimes tend to be a flashpoint. Particularly in this country, coming off of a very severe period of austerity where resources had to be scaled back in public services to meet some of these fiscal constraints and fiscal demands that were put on the country. Many public services had been underfunded for years in order to basically meet those austerity paradigm requirements. And so in that context, I think that's one reason why the schools become a flashpoint. I think the second reason is that part of this is myth, and then, you know, part of this, there's a grain of truth in this, but it's that parents of native-born children would like their children to get the attention, or native-borns would like to have the attention of native doctors or doctors. And so there does tend to be this kind of, this is where you see this competition for resources sort of playing out. And if parents feel that teachers have to spend more of their time dedicated to bringing other children up to speed, and that's going to hold their own children back, then this schooling. So it's not so much a matter of we don't want our children to go to school with these people. It's not that xenophobic of a narrative all of the time. Sometimes it is. But oftentimes it's, okay, special attention needed to bring these people up to speed in terms of integration is time that's taken away from skill building at the local level.
Yeah, makes sense. Can I come to you now, Alexandra? Alexandra Tragaki, Professor of Economic Demography at Harokopio. Do I say that right?
Harokopio.
Phew. Now, your background, therefore, it could not be more perfect for the OECD Crete Centre on Population. I mean, you know, that's it in your job title, isn't it? Economic Demography in the Department of Geography. You've been working on the relationship between demographic changes and their social impact. Can you see to what extent have host countries witnessed economic benefits from migrant entrepreneurship, you know, job creation, innovation? Have you seen that in Greece or elsewhere?
Okay, thank you for the invitation. Okay, I'm the last panelist in the last panel, but I still have to thank everyone for the honor of being here. So actually, there is, since the beginning of this conference, the very interesting and the very timely forum, there is the great debate about the social acceptance of migration as a response to demographic adversities and difficulties. But at the same time, in my mind, there is an opposite question. Up to what extent can effectively migration respond to the demographic deficits, and to what extent can migration respond to the gaps, the labor shortages, and provide the potential drive we need for the growth? And my answer is quite hesitant there. I think that immigration cannot provide the solution. And it is very hard for the countries to actually benefit from migration due to complexities, due to legislation problems, due to rigidities we have not managed to overpass. Anyway, unlikely to what has happened to other countries like the US, where 25% of entrepreneurship is due to immigrants, or unlikely to other even EU countries. Greece has failed up to now to benefit from the cultural diversity and for the skill variety of immigrants. And if we come down to migrant entrepreneurship, it is obvious that in Greece, migrant entrepreneurship is necessity and not opportunity-driven. We're talking about entrepreneurs of very small retail shops, food services, at the low end of the sectors, small barber shops, as you mentioned, usually addressed to their expatriates. So actually, on the one hand, this is not the kind of entrepreneurship that promotes the growth. There is nothing innovative in the question, there is nothing, but it's just a survival strategy for the migrants. But on the other hand, due to this very specific and very clustered character, it's not a social integration policy for the immigrants either. So there is a loss-loss situation here. Okay, of course there are some interesting and promising numbers concerning the latest figures about migrant entrepreneurship, self-employed and business set up by migrants, as mentioned by the initial presentation. But Greece, as you may have noticed in the famous graph, is well below the share of entrepreneurships across immigrants is much lower to that across natives, across Greeks. That highlights the certain unique barriers that happen in Greece and the specific profile of immigrants in Greece compared to other countries.
What are the unique barriers in Greece?
Language is one severe barrier.
Yeah. But there's tourism presumably opens up.
It is, but as Kristin mentioned previously, you don't choose the immigrants you have, so they do not forcefully speak English or the language of the tourists. But the data I'm talking about and the picture I'm describing mainly concern newcomers, mainly concern first-generation immigrants. It is very much probable that what happens across the second generation is completely different, mainly due to the education system. Because one thing that has happened perfectly well in Greece is that the immigrant children were very well absorbed by the education system, not without the problems that Kristin mentioned previously, and the conflict between the native parents and the immigrant parents about the immigrant presence in their classes. But after 20 years of this process, we can say that immigration has been education has been an integration process for the immigrants. So the second generation of immigrants in Greece is highly probable that has a different profile as an entrepreneur or as a worker. But one thing to mention is that in Greece, migrant entrepreneurship has yet to be recognized as a key component of migration policy on one hand and of economic growth, potential of growth on the other hand.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Now, it's great to have a first round from the panel, and they were admirably brief, so there is time for questions from the audience. Doesn't just, I should say, need to be on migrant entrepreneurship. I think they'll accept questions on migration in general. Looks like it from what's been said. Yeah, over there at the back. That's great. Thank you.
Lists and all the panels. Well, I mainly address the question to Mr. Awad. Till what extent do you supervise? Do I have to supervise my land workers in order not to have, let's say, a rebellion. Probably it's my problem because I have in mind all these DEA and free disposal rule models regarding managerial gaps, let's say, etc. And it was also, I have to thank a lot Ms. Zervaki, who is the Vice Mayor for Family Affairs, because she's managing the kindergartens of this town, and we had this case of a second-generation child from Morocco, 2.5 years old, and I have applied, and he was accepted in a Mayor kindergarten, and the kindergarten is wonderful, but unfortunately his mother is not working for me any longer. I had a rebellion at home because I was supervising probably her very severely.
Right. Thank you for that. I think that's probably a comment rather than a question. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to raise? Can't see any, so in which case I will go on to the follow-up question maybe to all of you, really about the sort of policies that you would most like to see. I mean, obviously we know migration is a nightmarishly difficult topic politically here, but in every country. What's your advice to governments to make their policies more socially acceptable by the population at large? And why don't we start with you, Evie?
Yes, thank you. I think that the most interesting part for me was this education part, because I really think this is the challenge for us. I really think that when we have children to be integrated in our country, it's much easier, and everybody's supportive, and I think that new programs and new funding that has to do with language support, which is the most essential thing in order to feel more well accepted, and the school study support, this has given us great results. We have a program in collaboration with UNICEF, All Children in Education. This is going very well. It's very successful, and the Ministry of Migration wants to even support it, and it needs more funding, because all the children that come under this program have a full support. They are going very well at school. They finish school, and then they are much interested in going to university. So I think this is a good practice of integration. So education is very important, and then I think that the migrant parents also feel more confident with themselves also, and with the future of their children. And the other thing having to do with the labor shortages, because Christine was very right that we don't choose, in most cases, the people, has to do with what we want to do with the Ministry of Labour to build even more with a better diagnosis of our needs and gaps. We have to be more concrete in that, so that we give a direction to these people wanting to come to Greece. What are our needs? What are the gaps that we want to fill? And these gaps, of course, have to do with highly skilled people, but also with low-skilled people in specific areas. We have some recent surveys that show that in Greece we have many needs in tourism, as you said, in construction, in retail market, and also have in works having to do with agriculture. So if we give the right sign, and if we are very responsible in that, maybe we attract the people that we need.
Maybe. Ibrahim,
in a better way.
I mean, you know, at the margins might make some difference. Ibrahim, from your point of view, and I don't know if you want to answer from the point of view of a recipient country or indeed an origin country, because
anyway, I failed to express my gratitude for being invited to the forum. So thank you very much. I failed to do that, so I have to say.
So I was not the last one.
No, you're not. And also thank OECD and Hellenic, the government of the Hellenic Republic, for asking me to be member of the advisory board. I think in the discussion, I think we encompassed, under migrants, we encompassed refugees as well. Yeah. And I think that policies should differentiate between migrants and refugees. For instance, the question of recognition of refugees, very often they just leave. So for the children, they don't have any proof, evidence of it. So this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and I think there are techniques now to recognize the level where the students have become. But I think that also the insertion in the labor market is different for refugees than for migrants. And this is why it would be good to differentiate policy measures. But at the same time, policy measures should also benefit for the host population. The host population, we do not want discrimination against migrants or refugees, but we do not want either host population to feel that it is losing and discriminated against. So I think we need to also address the policy measures. And this is why I think that measures for the insertion of migrants in the labor market, I think they should be in labor market policy measures. Labor market policy measures addressed to the entire population, and then you can have a subtract of these labor market policy measures addressed to migrants in accordance to their specific needs. But if you single out a policy, this might create resentment in the population, in particular in the context of austerity measures, as Christine has said. So I think that the formulation and presentation of policies is quite important. Now, again, Greece, for instance, in the last 10 years has been exposed to flows of refugees. But at the same time, Greece, for instance, a couple of years ago, entered into agreement on labor migration with Egypt. So, which means that the refugees who have come have not really met the demand for labor in Greece. So you need to reconcile. You need to reconcile all of that and to distinguish between migrants and refugees, and then have policy measures, distinctive policy measures in the different policy areas.
Very good. So same policies, but tailored.
Exactly.
To particular needs. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Reminds me of that horrific case when Sweden came very close to introducing a lower minimum wage for immigrants, which just strikes me as the most obviously counterproductive policy anybody could possibly, in terms of, stealing our jobs.
It could undermine the employment of natives.
Yeah, anyway, they didn't do it in the end, so let's give them the credit for that. Kristin, what about you?
Yeah, great. Well, I mean, I think I would reiterate on many of the things that were said, but I would also double down. I think it's interesting to see the sort of ebb and flow of what comes back into fashion in migration studies and refugee studies. And this idea of using migration to fill gaps and shortages is something that's more recently come back into fashion again. But I would say that when we think about that particular issue, and I have a lot of the same reservations that Alexandra has when it comes to the ability to do that, although there have been some successful bilateral agreements signed between Egypt and Greece, Bangladesh and Greece, there are new models, but there are fundamental things that you have to think about when you're going to construct these types of policies. So the first is the number. And this is what Evie gets to. So how do you know the number of people that you actually need? The second is the selection process. So how are you going to select these people? And then the third and the most fundamental and oftentimes the most polarizing are what types of rights are these people going to get? And are these going to be temporary rights? Are these going to be permanent rights? Or are they going to be temporary rights that may turn into permanent rights? And if you look at the research on labor migration policies, most of these targeted policies are temporary migration programs. They're not permanent. And many of them have been befret with problems over the years that only kind of emerge a little bit later down the line. And especially when you get to this question of numbers and selection, there are, I think, two important things, rights fundamentally being, very, very thorny in and of themselves, but numbers and selection are also pretty thorny too, because who's going to tell you the numbers? Are you going to let employers and employer associations tell you what the gaps are? Because if the employers are telling you what the gaps are, oftentimes employers have an incentive to keep wages low, hence this policy that you talked about in Sweden. So they may have a preference for migrant labor that the public doesn't share. And then these selection procedures as well, oftentimes there you're in government-to-government agreements. These are bilateral agreements, and governments change. So if the government of Egypt changes tomorrow, the government of Greece changes tomorrow, the government of Bangladesh changes tomorrow, how are you going to ensure continuity of that policy over time? And does the state have the capacity to actually execute that policy? Those are the kind of the questions that I would leave us with when it comes to these the temporary migration schemes.
Yeah. Thank you. Evie has to go, so we're going to say bye.
Thank you, Evie.
Bye to Evie.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for staying. So, Alexandra, you were indeed quite negative, I suppose, about the possibilities of getting anything positive. But how can we turn the negative into something a little bit more?
Actually, yes, I think that immigration is generally more acceptable as a policy to address labor shortages rather than as a strategy to offset low fertility rates. Yeah. So one thing is that we're talking more, what's more acceptable is to talk for short-term permits to fill in short-term gaps. So the question, however, is that if you have to take some policies, those policies need to be, in my view, balanced, evidence-based, and I mean balanced because what may have worked here does not necessarily work elsewhere. So you have to have a balance of what you remark and what you suggest. But on the other hand, it is crucial, in my view, to have a community-focused approach. The decisions need to be taken at a local level, tailored to specific communities with specific needs and specific resistances or tolerances against migrants. But what I would like to add as a final note is that without additional non-demographic policies, that would eventually foster growth, the migration impact remains limited. So those are the policies that we have tried to encompass in the National Action Plan for Demography. And among other things, what we suggest is to overcome some regulatory complexities and to promote some more easy and simplified process for integration, but also to promote the financial integration of immigrants through microfinance, through specific programs.
Interesting, yeah. Thank you very much. Jean-Christophe, I'm going to give you a chance. Well, I don't know if it's a right to reply. I suppose it's a right to comment on what you've heard in the panel discussion.
Yes, maybe I want to comment on some of the things you said, but also go back to what Tito said before, but this need to change the narrative on migration, because I think this is really to the point. I mean, the general public thinks migration is unmanaged and costly, Well, unmanaged we can discuss, because what is seen as unmanaged is actually a small part of migration. Most of migration is through legal pathways, but this is certainly something that needs to be considered very seriously. Costly, I mean, I think we need to look at this in a greater level of details. The OECD work on the fiscal impact shows that migrants contribute more in social contribution and tax than they receive in individual benefits in all OECD countries. It doesn't mean that there are not winners and losers with migration. We need to identify them. We need to recognize that, and we need to compensate these people who are more negatively potentially affected by migration. But when we talk about changing the narrative, it's really about moving from migration is a problem to solve to migration is a phenomenon, I would say a natural phenomenon, to manage well. And it's the managing well migration is not obvious, it's not a done deal, but this is where the issue is. And if you can change the narrative in the public opinion from a problem to solve to a phenomenon to manage appropriately, I think you've made already a big step forward. Part of that necessitates to explicit why we have migration, because it's not obvious. And some countries have tried to limit migration as much as possible. So it's important, if we want to explain that we are managing well, that we set up the objectives that we can measure the progress against. So obviously, labor migration. Why do we have labor migration? Is it to respond to short-term labor market needs, or is it to support productivity? This is not the same sort of migration you want to have. Family migration, this is a right. To which extent we want that right to be exercised by foreigners and natives or nationals. And humanitarian migration, which is also internationally recognized right, but you can set the bar at different levels. So you need to explain why you want to have that, and then you can be obviously, let's say, assess against the capacity to that you reach these goals. But I think it's all about changing the narrative and seeing that actually migration is and should be managed.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, panel. I'm going to cut it short, even though we're still green there, just because I'm determined that we don't go beyond 6 o'clock after the afternoon that we've had. So thank you very much. I hope you join me in thanking the panel.